Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton in Waynesville, North Carolina. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. Today is Tuesday, April 23rd, 2019. And Tuesday belongs to Mars. This is Mars Day. And recently, Mars went out of bounds. This is kind of a technical term that basically means Mars is in uncharted territory. Mars is beyond the range of motion that the sun defines in the sky as normal, right? So I can show you briefly on a little diagram here that I made, little sky diagram that I made. Here you can see Mars, and this line below Mars is called the ecliptic plane. That is the orbit of the Earth around the sun, circumscribed in the sky. This, so it's the orbit of the Earth around the sun, right? This line down here is the equator. This is the belt line of the Earth projected out into space. So it's the daily rotation of the Earth on its axis. So these two are tilted at about 23 degrees, 26 minutes to each other at this current time. That varies over extremely long periods of time, but it hasn't varied any time in the recent past and won't really any time in the recent future, barring some kind of weird cataclysm or something. So the maximum separation at the summer solstice, which is right here, this 90 in astronomical terms refers to 90 degrees from 0 Aries, right? So that's 0 Cancer. The sun reaches 23 degrees, 26 minutes and hovers there for 3 days around the solstice. And this is the bounds. This is what we refer to as the bounds when we talk about planets going out of bounds. Mars recently was, in this photo, you can see Mars here is conjunct Aldebaran. That was last week when the Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire. Mars was there with Aldebaran. We're going to talk a lot more about that in a minute. But you can see here, if we draw a line parallel to this curved line of the ecliptic, but parallel to this line down here of the equator, and we project it out, like Mars basically is already higher than the sun ever gets, because Mars is not exactly on the ecliptic. Mars is in the position of what we call north latitude here. It's a couple degrees north of the ecliptic. So even though it's not at the solstice point yet, Mars has already exceeded the bounds defined by the sun. Planets that are out of bounds typically act like mavericks. They act like rogues. They perform in the most extreme of their significations, can be manifested. I've had some really funky experiences with out of bounds. I taught an astronomy class for one of the astrology colleges for a while, and you know, a lot of times when I would teach this particular class about declination and out of bounds, we'd have people in the class who had their moon out of bounds, for instance. The moon is the most frequent thing to be out of bounds because it goes around the fastest, right? And I had some freaky experiences where it made me think that out of bounds north is different than out of bounds south, right? For instance, at another interesting fiery tower event, right? 9/11, Mars was out of bounds, but at the Capricorn solstice. So Mars was out of bounds south at that event. And, you know, this kind of sneaky The southern declination and southern latitude refer to from the northern hemisphere, which is where astrology, began and where most people to this day still live. It refers to a condition that's harder to see. It's relatively like, whoa, what's going on down there? Like, it's more subjective. It's more, and so, that whole event, like, there's still conspiracies about what exactly did happen. Can we believe, like, does a building just fall because a plane hits it? Yada, yada, right? So that now this one was, Mars was almost out of bounds going north, and the fire was in the top of the tower, right? And it was like really obvious. No, there was construction going on, something malfunctioned. We don't know if it was a wire or whatever, but there's no foul play here. Just a terrible accident, a terrible, basically these things were built in a time before, fire codes existed. Like, you wouldn't get away with building a building like that these days because it's terribly unsafe, and it was kind of a ticking time bomb. So yeah, this out of bounds north refers to an experience that is more visible, more in your face, more easily understood in terms of its objective reality, right? It's like right out there. And that, as you can see, Mars is going to continue along through here, and then he's going to pass under this star El Nath, which is in the tip of the bull's horn, right? This triangular group of stars here is called the Hyades. That's the face of the bull. The Pleiades is over here. This is the Pleiades. That's the shoulder of the bull. Then you can see here the front legs and so forth. And here's the other horn. The star is called Alchemical. And somewhere between like May 3rd through about May 10th, Mars is going to be in these horn stars of the bull. And these definitely signify like piercing, aggressive energies, right? To have the bull by the horn, so to speak, is to be wrestling with a very powerful situation, and dangerous, maybe even, right? So with Mars out of bounds and potentially making available its most extreme significations, it might be that we need to be very careful about taking things to extremes, because it could become dangerous or even destructive, even though maybe that's not, we're just trying to amp up the intensity a little bit, and the next thing you know, it goes way past what we were intending, right? That's one potential. The other potential is, hey, maybe there's a need for something that's beyond normal right now. Maybe there's a call for some aggressive or assertive energy to defend a boundary, or to take advantage of an opportunity that doesn't come along every day. So it could go either way, right? This could be, so an out of bounds planet could be like Lewis and Clark, right? They were sent by Thomas Jefferson to explore this unknown territory of the Louisiana Purchase. They were way out of bounds, but they were on a mission from the king, from the president. Or it could be somebody who's way out of bounds in an unhealthy way. Whether that's their intention or not, they end up out of bounds in a way that's not really healthy or productive. So yeah, and with Mars being in Gemini, that being an air sign, right? Mars is essentially fiery. Fire and air tend to, work together, right? So, again, some caution might be advisable, but at the same time, if you know what you're doing and there's a calculated risk in front of you, this could be an opportunity to go beyond something that's been holding you back, and now you have an opportunity to like get out there and and make something happen in a way that is unusual. So yeah, briefly, I want to look at this chart for the fire at Notre Dame because it's such a collective symbol that I think it really does carry meaning for each and every one of us, potentially. And the time that I have for when the fire broke out is about 6:20 p.m. local time there in Paris, France. And you can see that this puts 0 degrees of Libra rising. So the angles are right on the cardinal axis. The cardinal axis is known to be very powerful in world events. Um, you have this cardinal T-square of the north node and south node and the sun squaring those. So the sun is at what we call the bendings of the nodes, right? The sun is at the south bending of the lunar nodes. So there's this very emotional energy that's connected with this event, and yet very fiery, Sun and Aries, exalted. And this combination of Saturn, South Node, and Pluto it's really coming to a head, because pretty soon the node will reverse past Saturn, and although Saturn will station and follow it, and then actually pass it again, they'll never get. Saturn and Pluto will make a conjunction later, but the three of them, Saturn, South Node, and Pluto, won't be together this close again. So this is kind of the culmination of a really heavy energy that a lot of people have been kind of like, when I look at different forums online and people are talking about electional astrology for beginning events or making talismans or what have you, they're like, I ain't touching that, right? And that's really understandable in a lot of ways. You'll notice also that on the day of the fire, Mars was exactly 70 degrees from 0 Aries, right? So 30 degrees of Aries, 30 degrees of Taurus, and 10 degrees of Gemini, right? Saturn was the exact same distance, 30 degrees of Pisces, 30 degrees of Aquarius, and 10 degrees of Capricorn left. This is called contra antitia. They're equidistant from the Aries point. So again, this invokes that world axis of the tropical cardinal points. And so you have Mars on this fiery red star. You have the two malefics interacting with the world axis. And really, I'm pretty sure everybody got out of there without getting hurt. I don't know if there were any injuries to the fire crew, and I hope not, but relatively speaking, could have been a lot worse. I mean, the one thing that I take away from this is like, wow, we got this sort of collective symbol enacted without like anybody being able to start a war over it, at least, So there's that. But on a deeper psychological level, I think that this Saturn, South Node, Pluto signature, and also Mars to some degree, speaks to a process, an alchemical spiritual process that is available to all of us. And I talked about this a little bit on my page for the Hermetic Astrology podcast on Facebook. So I'm going to show you that real quick. Okay, so you can visit for day-to-day information. Like right now, I'm only doing the podcast about a couple times a month, right? And so for more day-to-day posting of like just heads up about celestial events or whatever, you can go to facebook.com/hermetic.astrology. Right, that's the page for the Hermetic Astrology podcast, and I'm posting photos there, articles, current events, whatnot. You can leave a review. Right, there's a review tab here. You can read reviews and leave reviews for the podcast. And you can see posts like this one that I made the other day, a couple days after the fire. And what I was talking about there is that if you understand this event in terms of a much bigger cycle, I think it can really give you access to this energy in a very personal way that can be very, so this heavy energy that you might think, oh, like keep that away, like, bury your head in the covers and hide from it. As natural as I can see that response being, it's actually very useful in an alchemical sense. And so that was my intent, is showing that. So what I was talking about is that the cathedral was begun in 1160 and completed in 1260. And if we understand that in terms of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, for instance, if we look at this wonderful ebook that my friend Kelly Lee Phipps made called Elemental Wave Chronicles, the year 1160 falls in between a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Taurus and a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Capricorn. So the Jupiter-Saturn cycle was anchored in the earth element at that time. And then it transitioned into air, back to earth, and then it had made several conjunctions, at least 2, in air signs before the cathedral was completed. So this transition from earth to air, I mean, think about the flying buttresses, right, that were necessary to support this mass of earth that had been raised to new airy heights, right? The temple itself is, cathedral itself is literally embodying this transition from earth to air. And this airwave was really the beginning of what we know as the Renaissance and so forth, right? Notice that this sequence, Taurus, Capricorn, Libra, Taurus, Aquarius, this is the exact same sequence that we happen to be living through right now. In 1940, we had Taurus, 1961, Capricorn, 81, Libra, and within this next 20-year period from 81 to 2000, we have the birth of the internet, right? Air. All of a sudden, all this air comes onto the scene. Then we had one more in Taurus before it finally transitions to air for good in 2020. So we're reliving, for the first time in 800 years, we're reliving the same exact sequence in the Jupiter-Saturn cycle under which Notre Dame was built. And what's fascinating about that is, they've figured out, like, there's literally not any trees in all of France to rebuild that roof the way it was built the first time around. So the cathedral is going to have to be rebuilt in a new way. And so there's like this mandate for change, for transformation. And that's what I was talking about. There's this same mandate for change that we see projected in Notre Dame Cathedral. It's in all of us, right? We all saw that, and there's a reason we all saw that, because it's in us too. And knowing that and acknowledging that and being willing to work with it could be tremendously transformative in a very positive way. Not necessarily easy, but it could be, in terms of alchemy, very, very transformative. So when we look at this process of change from earth to air on this mandala known as the square of opposites, we see that in terms of qualities, earth is dry and cold. So earth is like feminine, right? It's a downward pointing element. All the interesting stuff about earth is under the surface. You've got to dig down to find the cool stuff about earth. But once you do, you go, oh my goodness, here's this really interesting mineral, and here's this other one, and look at all. And that's the way earth people are too. They seem kind of chill and maybe even boring on the surface, but then you get to know them and you're like, oh my God, this person is incredibly multi-talented, so on and so forth, right? Now, air is moist and hot. So air is a lot more social than earth. Moist, right, togetherness. They're generally gregarious. They're also hot. They're pretty active. So earth and air don't share a quality. Moist and hot versus cool and dry. the only way Earth can transform into air is by going through one of these intermediary elements. Earth can change the quality of cold for hot, right? Rub a couple sticks together, dead Earth, and you get fire. And we saw that in the cathedral, right? That Earth literally transforming into fire. And or if Earth switches the quality of dry for moist, it can become like water, right? Eventually, when if you leave those sticks instead of rubbing them together and if you leave them alone, they will decay into soil and eventually like be more moist, more like water, and they might even eventually like be washed down into the ocean, right? They're those molecules. So that's what I mean when I say before us all lie two paths. There's a watery path and there's a fiery path. And these are the only ways for Earth to transform into air. And so we have a choice. Maybe we need to do both eventually, but initially we're going to have a choice. Am I going to take the fiery path or am I going to take the watery path? And this is a mandala that I made. Here's the alchemical symbol for air. Here's the alchemical symbol for Earth. Here's a Jupiter, Saturn, what they call a bind glyph, binding them together. And here are the fiery path and the watery path that can help us navigate between these two things. So yeah, so what does this have to do with alchemy and you know, regular people and their daily experience? So this fiery path that I'm talking about, in alchemy they call that calcination. The first step in transformation is about purification. If you go to the cathedral, if you go to a Roman Catholic cathedral, this is symbolized by the incense, right? They bring the incense through, and the burning of the incense purifies the air. There's a purification ritual, no matter what religion, whether it be indigenous or, you know, civilized or culture or whatever. Most of them start with a purification ritual. And in alchemy, this is called calcination. In shamanism, one way it's referred to is reduction to skeleton. You can see up there I have a ram skull, right? That's a symbol of what I'm talking about. This reduction to the primary constituents of something. It's very powerful medicine because when you, for instance, intellectually, when you encounter a new body, a new system of knowledge, all these books that I have on my shelf back here, for instance, if you can learn to break that down to its really basic components, and then you can decide, you know, what part of this do I need? What part of this will serve what I'm trying to build? And so you can keep that thing and maybe, you know, get rid of the rest. That's called separation. So there's a calcination, there's a reduction to skeleton, or a fiery burning away of the garbage, burning away of the detritus, right? You know, South Node conjunct Pluto, conjunct Saturn, right? The South Node represents like all this accumulated detritus that we, you know, we go through life and we collect junk. We've got all this stuff, right? There's a big trend now to like, oh, lighten your load and live, you know, give it all away. Only keep stuff that really gives you joy. And that's calcination. Reducing the another really potent metaphor is what the Vedic astrologers call sade sate. Sade being the root word for sadistic. And it can be a very brutal trimming of the tree of your life, right? So, but if you think of it like the trees are, you know, growing all the time and some branches die off. And if the wind comes along and hits that dead branch, it's going to push on the tree and potentially cause it to break. But if you can trim out that dead wood, the tree is lighter, more flexible, able to flow in the wind, and you know, in terms of movement, let's say if it's a moving being, the lighter you are, the less dead weight you're carrying, the more energy you're going to have, the more effective you're going to be, and so forth, right? So calcination can be a very positive thing, even though it's very difficult and very scary. Oftentimes you'll see, you know, this is associated in alchemy with the process of nigredo, blackening. You'll see skulls, skeletons, decaying stuff. You'll get images like this in your dreams, and the alchemists would use images like that to there's a death process that's going on, so that in cutting away the dead stuff, right, cutting that out and purging it is the point of, but first you have to see it for what it is, right? You have to actually get in touch with the death and the dying. And this is really interesting because now think about this for a second. Where does the tower exist within the larger milieu of the entire major arcana that's often referred to as the Fool's Journey? Right? The tower exists as in the middle, you know, just past the middle of that series, right? So here, let me pull up some visuals for that and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm going to pull up my favorite tarot to work with currently is the Alchemical tarot. So I've got Robert Place, his website pulled up here, and you can see that the tower, right, this incredible symbol that's been, you know, really in our awareness for the last 20 years, but definitely the last week, this image from the tarot has been kind of emblazoned and awakened in our consciousness, right? So understanding where that exists in the sequence of this overall journey of the Fool is important. And you'll notice that as the 16th card, the 16th trump of this series, it exists somewhere between the Death card and the Star, and later the Moon, the Sun, and Judgment. So there's an unfolding process of spiritual awakening that the Fool goes through, stages and steps along the journey. So anytime we see the tower come up, we need to couch that within a process of, okay, if you're at the tower, that means you are coming from death and temperance and the devil, and you're going to the Star and the Moon and the Sun, right? That's a given. Hopefully. Now, it's not a guaranteed. It's a given that you're in that you have that potential. It's a given that you know, you've probably experienced some of these cards. For instance, the devil. You know, a lot of people see that the different world leaders at the moment as the embodiment of that archetype, right? So is it any surprise that we find ourselves here at the tower? And death, you know, the understanding of, hey, you know, sometimes you got to cut out, you've got to, like, you know, give the kiss of death to certain things in your life before you can move on. You can't go on with, you know, accumulating stuff and accumulating karma, and so you've got to purge that stuff at some point in order to keep going. And you'll notice that the card that follows death is temperance. So there's this building of energy, right? Notice that, like the Lovers and the Chariot, right? There's this, you know, Chariot is victory and like moving through the world with your will, right? And strength, right? The Wheel of Fortune, and then along comes the Hanged Man and death, right? It's like you can only keep building energy and building material stuff for so long, right? The natural cycle is birth, growth, decay, death, and the cycle goes around, right? So you have to go through this process at some point, psychologically, spiritually, physically, right? All the cells in our body renew at certain intervals and so forth. And then after the death card comes temperance. Like, oh, maybe if I learn to balance these energies a little more, I can put off that encounter with death a little bit more, because I'm not just constantly building and then all of a sudden having to like get rid of all the excess. I can actually like moderate my energy and begin to grow in a more balanced, harmonious way, right? Then there's the encounter with the devil, which is basically an encounter with power and the nature of power, especially the nature of earthly power. Like, what am I in this for? Do I want, like, quick internet fame? Do I want to get 1 million followers and like and be all like YouTube famous and whatever? And then 6 months later getting dissed by somebody who wants to be internet famous and quick rise and a quick fall. Is that what I'm after? I don't know, like, not me. but yeah, what's your relationship? In a lot of cards you'll see that the lovers, which are combined into a hermaphrodite here, have chains around their neck, but the chains are chains they could remove at any time. And so that to a lot of people implies a relationship with addictions and unhealthy relationship with material power, right? And then if you're not able to remove that chain yourself and move on, what happens? The Tower comes along and says, like, enough of that. The Tower basically in classical reckoning is associated with Mars. I know a lot of people want to associate this energy with Uranus, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but in a classical sense, this card is related to Mars in the Golden Dawn system, for instance. And Mars and Uranus are very similar in my reckoning. They're hot and dry. They're fiery, right? So there's this need to like, boom, like, wait, like, what are you doing with all that material greed? And like, stop it. And something comes along and says, no, you can't do that anymore. Like, we're going to take that possibility off the table. So for in the cycle of addiction, this would be the Tower would be rock bottom. It would be like literally when they reach that point where they can't go on anymore and they have to accept the need for treatment and so forth, and so as a card related to Mars, it's essentially a war against the false authority, the false structures that the ego has mounted to like make itself feel big and powerful and important, right? Like, oh, look at me, I'm this, I'm that, right? And those things that we create, this persona that we create, can take on a life of its own. For instance, one interesting reading that I've seen I remember the first time, that I encountered the Iliad. Hector is a really lovable character. He's a really virtuous guy. He loves his wife. He's got a new baby. He loves his father. He loves his country. What a guy, right? But then when Achilles comes, he, instead of like saying, hey, bud, bugger off or we're going to fill you full of arrows, right? He accepts this challenge, and I, it boggled my mind at first. I'm like, why? What for? What does that serve? Well, there was this notion of of fate and of basically his persona of being the defender of the city, that he was bound by some obligation to answer this challenge at his own peril, right? So this is what I'm talking about, that these structures that we build, can take on a life of their own, and they're built on lies sometimes, right? Or half truths. And the nature of lies and half truths is that they are destructive. Ultimately, they cannot stand. You can't build a tower on lies and half truths. Eventually, it will fall. And so that's what the tower represents, is the casting out of falsity. And that's part of what the calcination is about. Like, and even if it's just falsity for you, right? Like, so for me, all these books back here, I'm not saying any of them are bad books. I'm just saying, look at all those books. I can't possibly use every sentence in every one of them. I have to pick and choose which points I'm going to use as I'm making my notes and my bibliography for my book, et cetera, right? And so casting out that which is not necessarily false or lies, but simply not useful or not part of the tower that we're building, right? So that it doesn't have these pieces that aren't necessary and that can weaken it, right? And then, of course, after the tower, we have the star. The star is associated with Aquarius and the Golden Dawn system, and the star is really a beautiful symbol. And you notice see how there's a lot of dark energy here in the Death card. Temperance is a bit lighter. Then you have really dark energy here with the Devil. The Tower card is kind of dark, and then all of a sudden there's this light in the Star card. So we're going from dark, negretto, blackening, understanding that some things need to die and go away before life can continue, understanding that our relationship with greed and lust and some of the more negative human emotions, like on the one hand it drives us towards success, on the other hand, like they can take over and begin driving the thing rather than propelling us. They can begin to pull us in places we don't really want to go, right? And so there's this negretto, this blackening, and then the star represents the first stage of the whitening. There's this brilliant white light, this guiding light, right? And whether it be the Star of Bethlehem in the Bible, or for Plato, it was the forms, the world of forms, these ideal forms, that he saw as like behind material existence and so forth. Edgar Cayce, he said, "Seek ye first the ideal. Know your ideals, and you will be guided by them. If you don't have a solid sense of your ideals, you'll just be wandering aimlessly, right?" So there's this sense of this higher purpose that comes with the star. And then with the moon, of course, the moon is brighter than any star, right? So there's this brightening of the light. And then with the sun, you have this dawn of this reddening, this final stage of the alchemical opus. And then with the judgment, it's kind of like the beginning of the completion of the work, right? So as we collectively engage with this tower symbol, we need to understand like what in our lives needs to go away and be burned up. What in our lives, where do we have an unhealthy relationship with power? What is the false structures that we've built into our lives that are running our lives instead of us running them, and so forth, and so that we can get to the star card and be liberated and be in touch with this transcendent light and be guided by it rather than the false authority of these ego structures, right? Okay, so that's the general idea. Now I want to zoom in here a bit and we talked about the fiery path of calcination, right? And how it can be hard and difficult and scary and maybe even dangerous, but that it can serve a purpose, a higher purpose. Now, I want to zoom in here a bit, if I can find the zoom button. There we go. And I want to talk about the watery path. Notice in the tower, in the alchemical, right, look at this. We have, like, in some sense, the combination of masculine and feminine in this image, but there's a lot of fire, right, and smoke. In this one, we have definitely smoke and fire through the lightning, but we also have these drops of water. And this vessel in the middle is what's called an alembic. It's a distillation vessel. So we have the introduction of the water element here that is in this sacred container, along with the fire. And then when we get to the star, there's a really serious focus on the water element, right? The star in the traditional card is pouring 1 cup back into the pool of water and 1 cup on the land, like keeping the cycle of life going on the land and keeping the cycle of emotion going on this side. So now we get to the watery path that I was talking about earlier. And the watery path, in some ways it's gentler. It can be just as difficult. It can be just as destructive, right? Water can be very destructive, just like fire. And that's kind of the point. Another way of dealing with this tower, rather than like with a fire, is to wash it away, right? If it's that out of control, that's one of the things that can happen. But ideally, if this fire were not, see how this fire is kind of like raging? The idea is to have a gentler fire, a slower circulation of energy where the water gets heated, it rises, and then it condenses and it falls back down. And there's this gentle cycle of heating and cooling this produces a distillate, a purified essence. And that's what we want to strive for, is the right amount of gentle heat. It's associated with likening of a bird sitting on a nest, right? There's this gentle heat of like just bodily heat that makes the eggs hatch. And then when we get to the star card, there's this purification through water of like, so once we calcinate something and we reduce it to its basic components, we have like the stuff that we want, and then we have all this burned up garbage, right? The point of the calcination was to burn away the garbage, but then we have the remnants of the garbage. So we need to introduce like an acid or a bath of some kind to wash away all that other stuff, and to kind of gently loosen up the bonds of this of these ego structures, so that they can be less rigid and begin to open up. It's a really interesting fact, for instance, that in human psychology, personalities aren't really truly stable until about the age of 30. That's when personality inventories begin to be really stable. So, and which is like perfect for Saturn, right? The calcification, the concentration and stabilization of something, right? But the problem with that is that, you know, it can become more and more rigid until it's like we're like sort of automatons or robots, right? We're just going along on this pre-programmed thing, and there's hardly any, we don't see any options other than the way we've been living. It's we're like living with these blinders. And what they've found is that two things can significantly modify that. One is some kind of religious experience of the transcendent, and then the other is like psilocybin therapy. So after the 60s, when everybody was passing out drugs like candy, or the government got like kind of heavy-handed and said, no, we're not going to have chaos. We're going to like control these things and blah, blah, blah. And actually, even the research into these substances was shut down. But they've started to be able to research these things again, and they're using psilocybin therapy for alcoholism, for instance. And they've seen a dramatic reduction in people's need to drink, but that this transcendent experience that they get through the psilocybin reduces their need to drink somehow. It kind of washes them clean, and they they don't have this unhealthy urge as strongly. And it also makes people score a lot higher on measures of openness. So it kind of loosens up the Saturn structures and makes people able to see and choose more openly. And that can be, a really healthy thing, because healthy boundaries are semi-porous. They definitely keep some things out, right? Boundaries are for protection. You want to keep a lot of things out, but there has to be an exchange through even just your cell membranes, right? They have, the stuff has to be able to cross back and forth in and out of those for life to go on. So this watery path is called dissolution. And by the way, I have, for my premium members, I have links to, for instance, Dennis Hoke, who one of my favorite alchemical authors. He wrote a book on the Emerald Tablet. I'm not a fan of these idiots' guides generally, but his Idiot's Guide to Alchemy is really excellent. And he's got a podcast, Alchemergy. But I've got links to these processes of calcination and distillation and so forth for people to read more and experience more, to understand that these two paths that are available to us, as we willingly and consciously engage with them, we will need the experience of them intruding on us less and less. You see, that's the idea. That's the magic of astrology. If we know what's going on, oh, the sky says do blank. Okay, let's do blank, and then we don't have to have it done unto us, right? That's the basic idea. Okay, and just in case for those of you who may not be familiar with that program, if you go to my website, dreamastrologer.com, and there's a page in the navigation bar, it says special offers. There's a place here right in front where you can subscribe, and there's also a whole page where it talks about what you get at each level of subscription. And then if you go all out and get the gold level, you get the monthly reports. Like there's a 9 or 10 page report with horoscopes for Mars out of bounds and links to all this alchemy stuff. You get that at the bronze level. At the silver level, you get reduced rates for consults. So if you get more than a couple consults a year, that becomes a way that you can actually save money. Then at the gold level, you also get access to my archives, which is literally like, I had a new gold level subscriber recently, and I sent them the link, and they're like, holy crap, how much stuff is in there? That like blew up my Dropbox. I don't have room for all of it. And I was like, I haven't checked lately. It's like 15 or 20 gigabytes of information. So there's literally dozens and dozens of lectures on alchemy, the cycles of Mercury, the cycles of Venus. There's a Venus-Mars module. There's eclipses. There's retrograde loops. There's a goddess, an asteroid goddess module. So there's a ton of content there that's available instantly when you sign up at that level. So just so people know that that's there. Okay, so let's return to this topic of Mars out of bounds, and then we'll wrap it up. Mars is going to be out of bounds. It started in April, mid-April, April 20th, and I think it lasts through June 12th, mid-June. So Mars is going to be out of bounds for a while. And what I did is I divided this up naturally into Mars out of bounds in Gemini versus Mars out of bounds in Cancer, because Cancer, Mars actually has some dignity, and I think it might be a bit more manageable. And also, Mercury is going to form a relationship with Mars in late May. They're both going to be out of bounds, and they're going to be parallel and in Tisha. So I'm going to talk about that next month. So just so you know, it's not like 2 full months of like, oh, watch my Mars and like be super careful. I think mainly it's this period in Gemini, right? So And it's interesting to me, I wanted to show you this. It's interesting that this Mars energy showed up in the form of this fire only after Mercury was recently done with its retrograde loop in Pisces. So Mercury is spending more time in the water element. Mercury is spending literally half the year in water signs. So that means the other 9 signs together make up half the year, and 3 signs make up the other half of the year. So Mercury's spending an inordinate amount of time in the water element. So the watery path is probably one of the most available paths to us. And as I say, I mean, it's a gentler energy. It's kind of like washing things clean. It's more goddess, more feminine, and so forth. Fire can be harsh and scary unless it's that gentle fire of like sitting on eggs and stuff, right? That's the one we really want to work with if we can. But yeah, it was only after Mercury completed this recent Negredo, Albedo, Ribedo process of this retrograde loop in Pisces, April 11th, that this fiery path was able to overcome. It was almost like the water of Mercury retrograde was preventing this this fiery energy coming forth, and then after Mercury was done with that, then this fiery energy was able to take over. So I think that for a couple reasons, when Mars gets into Cancer, it'll be a little less volatile, and also Mercury will then begin to form some interesting relationships with Mars, and that will make the watery path more available again. So yeah, in particular, I would watch for this period from about 3rd of May through about the 10th of May, when Mars is in these horn stars of the bull. It's interesting also, like I should have made this a little bit bigger, but these 3 constellations that are here, you have, really there's 4. You have the bull and the twins, and then you have Orion, and up above, you can't see it, but there's this Auriga, the charioteer. And you know, I talk about this in the Uranus. The planet Uranus was discovered right here in this space between these bull's horns. Okay, and I think Uranus was discovered by a group of people. Yes, Herschel saw it with the help of his sister Caroline. But it was really it was Messier and a bunch of other scientists that got together and said, no, Herschel thought he saw a comet. And they, no, that's not a comet. Let's see. Oh, well, other people saw some interesting stuff in this neighborhood. Let's link those together. Oh, no, it must be a planet. So Herschel didn't discover a planet. The planet was discovered collectively. And of course, Uranus is a collective planet, right? So that's interesting. But one of the things that I talk about, and this is available in the archives too, I have a whole section on the discovery charts of the outer planets, is that you kind of have this lower vibration of Orion, which is was like this super male, aggressive hunter who kind of got carried away and boasted that he could kill every living thing in the world. And then Gaia sent this scorpion to kind of hunt the hunter. And eventually Zeus put them in the sky in opposing places. So as the hunter is setting, the scorpion is rising, chasing him out of the sky, right? And by the way, I wrote an article for astrology.com. There's a link on the articles page of my website where you can click on it. It'll show you all the articles I've written for them this year. I think there's like 8 of them already, and I'm still going. But I did this mythology article. It's been shared like 5,000 times already, which is really cool. And I think that shows a lot of people are enjoying it, where I talk about that myth, for instance, with Scorpio and whatnot. But it seems like and when I talk about the Taurus myth too, I mean, Taurus is an animal that has been domesticated, right? It's been controlled. So the bull as a wild bull would represent the wild, forces of nature, but as a domesticated animal, it would represent like this controlled, like that gentler form of fire that I was talking about, that's controlled and able to and regulated, right? And then the charioteer would represent even higher, where like we can control that animal enough to tether it to a vehicle and like move through the world in ways unprecedented, and requiring the building of roads and so forth. So there's kind of like three levels of expression of this energy also. It doesn't necessarily have to show up in its lower form. It can show up in this higher form of the charioteer. But as I said, even within that, if you look at the chariot in terms of it's definitely a very yang, aggressive energy that can be accessed right now with Mars and Gemini. But ultimately, within this larger context, as I said, of understanding where this tower is showing up in your life, and maybe that Mars energy can be helpful in like going, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, this thing over here, like I don't really need that. Like, knock that out, Mars. Thank you for that extra dose of out of bounds stuff where I can like, normally I don't just like, I'm not that ruthless. I don't just cut things out of my life, but you know what? Like, seems to be the right time to do that. So there you go. That would be, the healthy way to invoke and involve this energy. Okay, so thanks for tuning in, everybody. I really appreciate y'all listening and writing in and sending reviews in and joining up. We've got a wonderful group on Facebook now. We've got a secret group that goes with the premium membership where we're all hanging out together, and that's been really fun. We also do some private members only webinars from time to time, and that's been a lot of fun. We're going to have, recently I announced in my newsletter, we're going to have SAC 3, the third Sky Astrology Conference is coming up next year in July. And we're going to be announcing the opening of registration for that pretty soon. And there's going to be some free webinars for that. I think in my last newsletter, I gave out a free download for some. So stay in touch. There's lots of good stuff coming, some more freebies and some more premium stuff. And so thanks again for tuning in, and nice to have you here. And until next time, bright blessings. Namaste.